An older couple sat together on the train, quietly chatting as they rode through the countryside. But their pace was suddenly disturbed by a fully grown boy sitting across from them. "Dad, look!" the boy exclaimed to his father. "Giant green trees are going past us." The boy must have been almost 20 years old and had a huge smile glued to his face. His father smiled along, almost encouraging his outburst. The couple looked at the boy's childish behavior with a pitiful glance before going back to their conversation. Suddenly, the boy erupted with excitement again and shouted, "Dad, look at the clouds running along us in the sky!" At this point, the couple couldn't resist, and the wife went quietly over to the boy's father. "Why don't you take your son to a good doctor and get him some help?" she whispered kindly. The old man smiled and said, "As a matter of fact, I did. We're actually returning from the hospital right now. My son has been blind since birth, and today is the first time he is experiencing the gift of sight. Wouldn't you be just as excited?" You see, as human beings, we have the remarkable ability to jump to conclusions, assuming that we know the truth of a situation when we've actually misjudged it completely. One of the most powerful learning experiences we can have is a paradigm shift, a shift in perspective and perception that allows us to see something in a fundamentally different way. Chazal tell us that Avraham faced 10 tests along his spiritual journey. And while it's commonly assumed that Akedas Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, was Avraham's 10th and final test, several commentators explain that the 10th test was actually after the Akedah. They suggest that Avram's 10th trial was the death of his wife Sarah and the subsequent episode of burying her in Ma'aras HaMachpelah, the cave of Machpelah. And this assertion is mysterious because it seems that the command to sacrifice one's own child will be the ultimate test, incomparable to the ordeal that followed. So what was the true nature of Avram's test of burying Sarah, and why is it viewed as so incredibly difficult? Well, on the most basic level, it appears as though Avram was challenged with overcoming the grief of losing his wife, as well as dealing with Ephron, a conniving, merciless cheat. There is, however, a deeper answer, one related to the power of paradigms. Perhaps Avram's test was a question of perception, a challenge to view Sarah's death as an opportunity to grow rather than a reason to give up, a chance to build rather than fall apart. And in this light, Sarah's death was not the end, but the beginning. Let's explore this idea. Chazal teach us that marriage is eternal. Man and wife are created as one before birth, and they're then torn apart and born individually, charged with the mission of connecting and recreating that oneness in this world. Man and wife are thus born into separate families at different times and locations, and must then embark on the journey of life to find each other and reconnect as one. After a lifetime of building that oneness, man and wife remain eternally one in Olam Haba, the world to come, enjoying the bond they created during this lifetime. And this explains one of the unique sources for the laws of marriage. Maseches Kedushin, the tractate of marriage, details the various methods by which a man and woman can get married. And one of them is through money, kesef, which is derived from the transaction between Avram and Ephron. The Gemara draws a parallel between Avram's use of money in acquiring Ma'aras Machpelah and man's ability to use money to create a spiritual and halachic connection to his wife, pointing out that both use the word kicha, kicha misnei Ephron. It seems strange, though, even ironic, to derive a source for marriage from a case in which a man's wife dies. However, this is not ironic, nor is it a coincidence. It's a reflection of the deep truth that marriage is eternal. Through buying this plot of land, Avraham planted the seeds of his eternal marriage with Sarah. They would be buried together and remain bonded as one even after death. And this explains another unique feature of Ma'aras HaMachpelah. Ma'aras Machpelah is located in the city of Hebron, a word related to the concept of connection. The root of this word is chaver, the Hebrew word for friend or partner. Hebron is a place of connection. It's where Avram and Sarah are buried together, where they solidified their eternal connection. It's interesting to note that the Torah repeatedly describes how Avram purchased a plot of land in front of the entire town. This purchase was, in a sense, Avram building an eternal marriage between himself and Sarah, and a wedding has to be performed before a kahila, a public group of people. Thus, we see how Avram's 10th test was to perceive this as an opportunity to build, as opposed to an ordeal to pass over. This wasn't simply Sarah's death, it was the next stage of their eternal connection. And this beautifully explains why the Torah records Avraham's death specifically at the end of Parshas Chayei Sarah. Because once Avram built the foundation for their eternal connection, Avraham was able to join Sarah in the next world, married forever. And we can take this idea of eternal marriage even further. In Jewish law, there are two stages of the marriage process. The first step is Kiddushin, followed by Nisuin. Originally, the custom was to perform Kiddushin a year before Nisuin, leaving a full year until the marriage process was completed. And many Jewish thinkers ask, what's the purpose and the relationship between Kiddushin and Nisuin? What's going on here? Why is there a two-step process of marriage? And while there are various reasons given, the Rambam explains that although Kiddushin and Nisuin are both fundamental to the process of marriage, they serve completely different functions. Kiddushin, the first step of marriage, is actually a step back in the relationship. It creates an issur, a prohibition between a man and his future wife, while also making them forbidden to anyone else. And after this step back, Nisuin is then 2 steps forward, creating a fundamentally stronger and more meaningful marriage because the couple had just spent an entire year apart longing for one another. And this is a classic example of Yerida L'Tzorech Aliyah, a step down that enables a giant leap upwards. And perhaps this is why we specifically learn the mitzvah of Kiddushin and not Nisuin from the episode of Avram burying his wife. Because in a very deep way, Sarah's death was the epitome of Kiddushin. Her death created a painful, heartbreaking separation between Avram and Sarah. However, this was only temporary. This time apart would soon be followed by Nisuin, when Avram would join her, completing their eternal marriage. At the end of Parshas Chayei Sarah, Avram is nifter, he passes away, and he's buried next to his wife in Ma'aras Machpelah, connected eternally. Nisuin had finally occurred. And the Maharal takes this one step further. He explains that all of Tchias HaMesim, the resurrection of the dead, will begin from Ma'aras HaMachpelah. Why is this so? What's significant about this specific location? The Maharal explains that it's because Ma'aras HaMachpelah serves as the root and model for the concept of eternal marriage. Man and wife are created as one before birth, and they must then recreate that oneness during this lifetime, remaining eternally one in Olam Haba. But there's one more step. They are then reborn into this world as one during Tchias HaMesim. This is why the Hebrew word for grave, kever, is also the Hebrew word for womb. Because the grave is where we're buried, but it's also where we will be reborn at the end of days. In other words, we are like seeds planted in the ground waiting to sprout. Ma'aras HaMachpelah is where Adam and Chava and all the Avos and Imahos were buried. It's not only holy because the Avos and Imahos are buried there, but the Avos and Imahos are buried there because it is holy. Machpelah comes from the word kefel, doubled. It was a doubled cave. It had 2 levels, representing the connection between the spiritual world and the physical world. It was the place where 2 people become one, where two-ness becomes oneness. It's where all marriage and oneness is planted, destined to ultimately be reborn during Tchias HaMesim. And this was Avraham's 10th and final test. It was a challenge of deepening his perception. While on the surface, Avram was burying his wife, facing the death of his life's partner, there was a deeper layer here. He was also planting the seeds for their eternal connection. Truly seeing is not about what we see, it's about how we see. And this is a deep truth of perception. We choose how we see the world, how we experience life. Our paradigms can empower us or cripple us. Our worldview can inspire or paralyze. The choice is solely up to us. And this is the beauty and potential tragedy of perception. Avram teaches us this lesson most powerfully when it comes to marriage. The connection we build in this world is not ephemeral or fleeting. It's infinite and eternal. So let's be inspired to walk in the footsteps of Avram and Sarah and build deeper and more empowering perceptions in life. Because just like the boy who was suddenly given sight, each day we have to choose to see with new eyes, recognizing that while yesterday we were blind, today we can finally see.